to introduce herself this time, and then bring us up to date with what's happening with refugees from Afghanistan and from Ukraine. Welcome, Samantha.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you to Mary Jo, who reached out and asked me if I wanted to speak to the Muleskinners. My name is Samantha, or Sam Moog, and I'm the Director of Refugee Services at Catholic Charities of Central and Northern Missouri. I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I have a background in providing direct social services to different populations, including people, refugees and immigrants, people living with severe mental illness, and families in Boone County. So I also was the grants manager for Catholic Charities for several months before I applied for the director position of Refugee Services, and I've been in the position of Director of Refugee Services since December 2020. So at the end of the first year of the pandemic, and it has been at the beginning of a new presidential administration. So it's been a really, really, really wild ride and very interesting time to be working in refugee resettlement. When I started in December of 2020, the agency had about 8 or 10 staff. The Refugee Services Program, it had just been split off from our Immigration Services Program, and Lorna Tran, the longtime director of Refugee and Immigration Services, is now just the director of Immigration Services, and Refugee Services is its own program. At that time, we had resettled about 20 people in the last 12 months, the last year, and that number was the lowest that it has ever been, I believe, for the organization. Catholic Charities was incorporated in 2011, but before that, the Diocese of Jefferson City has been resettling refugees in mid-Missouri since 1975, starting with the Vietnamese at the end of the Vietnam War. So during the last presidential administration, I'm sure you all are aware that the president, in consultation with Congress, sets the ceiling for refugee admissions, meaning the maximum number of refugees that are going to be admitted to the country via the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, and that number decreased significantly during the last presidential administration, and then it increased very significantly to the highest that it has ever been during the current administration. Meanwhile, the pandemic had also had a really, really profound effects on the refugee resettlement, because it affected the processing that refugees go through before they get here. It affected processing internationally and in the United States, and that pipeline slowed down. It had a lot of clogs in it because of staffing, health issues, offices being shut down, and more health measures being put into place. And so when I became the director in December of 2020, it was in that context of a refugee resettlement program that was honestly really lucky to have its doors still be open. A large percentage of refugee resettlement agencies closed because of the combination of the pandemic and the decrease in refugee admissions. made it not sustainable for refugee resettlement agencies, smaller ones especially, to keep their doors open. So I'm really glad that we were able to weather the storm. We saw when I began in the first 4 months, we didn't resettle a single person. And so as of, August 2021, we had several arrivals, but not very many. And then but we were planning for a huge expansion of refugee resettlement because of the clogs in the processing were getting fixed, and obviously the new presidential administration raised the refugee ceiling to 125,000 from, I can't even remember what the previous administration had it at, but historic low. It may have been 12,000 or 18,000. 125,000 admissions, that was aspirational, but that wasn't going to happen. Our operational capacity was more like 65,000 for the whole country. But in August of 2021, obviously the US military withdrew from Afghanistan, and this resulted in the Afghan security forces almost overnight really losing their ability to control the country, and the Taliban taking over the country. And there were many people in Afghanistan over the last 18 or however many years we were there who supported the US government, who worked at the embassy, who were cooks at Air Force bases, who were interpreters, who worked with NATO, and who worked in the Afghan security forces, and a lot of different professions, a lot of different families who either supported or worked as contractors directly with the US government. And as you all know, in August, people fled to Kabul and to the airport to try to get out of the country because the US was airlifting people out, and that was the only way out. All of the borders were controlled by the Taliban, and I think over 100,000 people were airlifted out by the US government, and some other governments had airlifted people out as well. And these people were then brought to lily pads in countries like Qatar, Germany, where they went through vetting and processing to come into the United States. However, these people that were directly airlifted out of Afghanistan, the vast majority of them did not have refugee status. And the reason for that is that refugees flee their country of origin and register with the UNHCR in usually an adjacent country or wherever they fled to. And these people, they never fled Afghanistan. They were immediately airlifted out. And so because of that, the State Department, had to create an entirely new program to serve these people and their humanitarian parolees or evacuees. They don't have refugee status. And in fact, there is hopefully legislation very soon to be considered that would allow the status of Afghan humanitarian parolees to be adjusted. Right now, their parole only lasts 2 years after they arrived in the United States, and they have to either apply for asylum or get a special immigrant visa if they're eligible for that. Otherwise, their parole will expire. And so there's this huge issue with this kind of immigration status limbo for the Afghan humanitarian parolees. So winding back to August, refugee resettlement agencies were called upon by the State Department to resettle these Afghans in our community. Again, in the context being that our infrastructure was just starting to rebuild. Many agencies had closed. And so this is, nearly 100,000 people when, the United States had resettled a very, very small percentage of that, in the previous few years. So after people were processed and vetted in lily pads, they were brought to US military bases in the United States. I had one staff member who deployed to Marine Quantico base and was there assisting with efforts. There was more processing going on, and organization and placement of these individuals in resettlement agencies all over the country. So we were approached by our national agency, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, to participate in this resettlement effort of the Afghan humanitarian parolees. And we discussed it with our national partner, with our local stakeholders, with the state refugee coordinator for Missouri, with community members, and we knew that it was our obligation to do this, and that we had been preparing for a scale up, and that our community was incredibly welcoming. And so we began resettling Afghan humanitarian parolees, and between the end of, we received our first arrival in September 26th, and then between September 26th and January 20th, I believe, we resettled 284 Afghan humanitarian parolees in central Missouri, including in Fulton and Jefferson City and Columbia. We also resettled 2 special immigrant visa holders from Afghanistan who actually already have that status, and so they're not humanitarian parolees, they're special immigrant visa holders. This was a historic effort, and it was able to be accomplished through the collaboration with many different agencies locally, through the creation of a community sponsorship program, the sacrifice of our staff, and the will of our community, and just how welcoming we are. And now we're about maybe 6 months out from when the vast majority of people arrived, and people are adjusting to life. They're adjusting to becoming more self-sufficient. Kids are enrolled in school. Heads of household have been employed for some time. We are working on everyone's immigration cases. People have bought cars or had cars donated. People are pursuing higher education opportunities now. And people are learning how to pay their rent on their own, utilities, what it means to have less dependence on our agency and more autonomy and independence navigating the community. So it's been a really, really challenging but very rewarding experience. And I want to leave lots and lots of time for questions, because so much has happened and so much has gone on, and it's been such an enormous effort that sometimes I don't even know where to begin. So I will definitely, let me see what time it is, 12:36. I'm going to speak a little bit to the Ukrainian refugee situation, and then I want to leave lots of time for question and answer, so I can more directly address the things that you're particularly interested in. So with the war in Ukraine, I have one staff member who was a Peace Corps member in Ukraine and went to Poland for a couple of weeks, worked on the border, and she speaks Russian, and she's been working with our Ukrainian refugee population in Sedalia. So we many people don't know this, but Catholic Charities actually resettles Ukrainian refugees on a regular basis, and we have for many years. And the Ukrainian refugee population is primarily, actually 100% resettled in Sedalia, Missouri, where there's a significant Ukrainian and Russian population. And virtually all of these cases that we resettle are family reunification cases. So they're reuniting with people who are already here, and their families have petitioned for them to join them. And these are people who belong to, for example, religious minorities, differing political opinions, that allow them to have pursued refugee status. And then they're petitioning for their derivatives and family members to join them here. In March, when the war began, we actually had a Ukrainian family who was scheduled to arrive on the 3rd of March, I believe, but their flight was canceled because the airspace over Ukraine was closed. And since then, the family fled to Moldova, was able to rebook with the International Organization for Migration, and now they're on our schedule again to arrive, I believe, this month, in a few weeks. So the U.S. government has made this commitment to welcome, I believe, 100,000 Ukrainian refugees. It is a very, very different situation than Afghanistan. In Ukraine, we didn't have a large military presence for 18 years, and it's a very different situation. We're not airlifting people directly out. People are fleeing to neighboring countries for the most part, registering with the UNHCR. And it's not clear exactly yet to refugee resettlement agencies what this means in practice. I do know that Ukrainians who have already made it to the United States, for example, not through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, have temporary protected status, meaning that they're allowed to stay and work, but they're not refugees, and they're not eligible for therefore they're not eligible for the services that we provide because they don't have the qualifying status. Now, this may change, but for example, I know that there's many Ukrainians who crossed from the Mexico border and then came and joined their community in Missouri, but we're not able to serve these people through refugee resettlement programming. The idea is, I think, that a lot of these family petitions that bring people through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program are speeding up, hopefully. A lot more of these applications will be submitted. We have our local staff who are already working with the Ukrainian community to get those applications submitted, and those people will come through, hopefully, if their petitions are successful, the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. But that's really not a change from what we've already been doing. It's just that there's more attention on this, more urgency surrounding this, and maybe there's some more resources being put into processing these applications. So I can't say for sure. I haven't seen yet in a huge impact in our or change in our Ukrainian refugee resettlement. It might just be illuminating to the community that we in fact were already doing this, and we will continue to do this. But when I began talking about Afghanistan and what we anticipated we'd be doing, I had no idea that we would in fact be resettling close to 300 people. And so that being said, things could change with the Ukrainian refugee situation, although I just don't have enough information at this time to make to say this is exactly what we can expect. So yeah, I see there's some hands raised. So yeah, let's begin the question and answers.
I'm wondering how it's decided where the person goes or the family goes if they don't have family in the United States.
Thanks, Pam. That is a great question. So for refugees, not the Afghan humanitarian parolees, but refugees, 75% of our arrivals have what's called a U.S. tie, which is when they have somebody who actually lives here, a friend, usually a relative, that ties them to this community. So that other 25% who don't, typically we would resettle them in Colombia, where there's a lot of infrastructure to support the refugee population in terms of the public schools and the English language learning opportunities and the employment opportunities. However, with the Afghan humanitarian parolees, we saw communities outside of Colombia step up and say, we want to participate in this resettlement opportunity. And so we partnered with community sponsorship groups who work in concert with our agency to be able to actually resettle people in Jefferson City and Fulton. And without coordination with, without having vetted, onboarded, trained, and worked in concert with these community groups in Jefferson City and Fulton, we wouldn't have been able to successfully resettle people there. So I think the answer to your question is Colombia has been the sorry, go ahead.
What I mean is, how is it decided on what part of the country? Okay, they could go to New York, or they could go to Florida, or how is it decided? I guess the State Department makes that decision. I don't know.
So we as an agency, so it happens at a few different levels. I guess I'll start from the national level. There's every week there's a meeting that the State Department holds with all of the 9 national level refugee resettlement agencies. So the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is one of them. There's also, Jewish Vocational Services, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, Lutheran. They tend to be 7 out of the 9 are faith-based because of the history of how the faith communities have welcomed the stranger and been really involved in immigration efforts historically. But they sit down at the table once a week, and the State Department looks at the cases, the refugee cases that are coming in through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, and they get allocated to the 9 national level agencies based on, okay, if they have a U.S. tie, what resettlement agencies operate in that region? That would be, a determining factor. They look at the case composition, the country of origin. For example, there's a large refugee communities in certain communities, like Minnesota, for example, has a large Somali population, and there's different. What we know is that people tend to be successful when they're welcomed into a community that already has a lot of people who speak the same language or from the same place. They're able to, help each other out. So that's one of the factors. They also look at medical conditions, where if somebody has a medical condition, they need a certain kind of care, which resettlement locations are able to accommodate the needs that a family may have. They also look at the spots that each resettlement agency has open. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops tends to have the largest percentage of refugees allocated to it among the 9 at the national level.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I think I'm next now. Appreciate it. Thanks again for being here, Samantha. I'm curious, how do you find housing for refugees? Do you all already have a bank of houses available or places for them to stay? Or do you go out when you find about a family, you have to go and dig and hunt around? What's that process, or what's available?
Yeah. When we were thinking in August, what can we do? How many people can we accommodate, we were really thinking about housing as one of the primary factors. And at that time, we took a really diversified approach to housing. So we not only were going the traditional route, working with local landlords, but we also, we went with Airbnb, had a partnership with U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to provide emergency housing. So we had various families take advantage of Airbnb opportunities. We also created our own emergency host home program, and we had several families participate in that program and received emergency placement in a host home for a specific period of time. We also we were able to staff up in our housing department. Like until October or November, we didn't have a dedicated housing team because we were not resettling enough refugees for that to be a staffing like its own department. But luckily, with the funding coming in, we now have 3 dedicated housing staff, and they do an amazing job of proactively identifying housing opportunities, applying for community-based rent assistance, teaching clients about home maintenance, and also we had our community sponsorship groups too. So in Jefferson City and Fulton, by expanding our the cities that we were working in, it expanded the housing opportunities too. So yeah.
I'm a trustee with St. Francis House, and we were able to dedicate our new building, and I think we've got 2 families coming in there. So.
Wow, yes. Yeah, and then people in the community have been reaching out to us saying, we have this housing available. We want to assist in any way that we can and make this available. So thank you so much to the St. Francis House for that opportunity. And it's really incredible. I mean, it is incredible what the community response has been, and that's how we're able to do this. Thank you for your question.
Alice, your question? Alice?
Sure if she can answer this, but and how many years you actually have worked with refugee resettlement, but did you see a mass speed up of refugees coming in close to the timeline of when we pulled out troops compared to the prior administration, where I read they were sort of holding up paperwork of getting out the refugees? I don't know if you can speak to that.
What I do know is that staffing in the State Department and
Very low.
was decreased, was at lower levels, and that definitely makes a big impact on the whole system. I do know that now the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is the government department that operates the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. State Department operates the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. The Office of Refugee Resettlement funds a lot of the programs that serve refugees who arrive through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. And that department has been staffed up and has been able to work really cooperatively with the 9 national level agencies, and has shown a real interest in building up the infrastructure for refugee resettlement and making sure that there's funding available so that agencies can operate. So not sure if that exactly answers your question, but yeah, there's been drastic changes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Carl and Mari?
Yeah, I had a question, Samantha. Thank you for being here. Actually, it's kind of a 2-part question. The first one is just, for how long can your agency assist refugees after they get here? And then the second part is, how do you work with other community organizations that are also providing help for newcomers who may not strictly meet your qualification as a refugee, but who are coming in through these other routes?
Yeah, great questions. Okay, so the first was, I got really focused in on your second question. What was your first?
How long are you able to assist a given family, say, after they arrive?
Yeah, wonderful question. I feel like there is a misconception in the community about this. So I like having the opportunity to address this. So our agency, and really we implement federal programs, and so every single resettlement agency in the entire country has the same requirements and the same, they're looking for consistent outcomes, and we operate the same programs. So, you know, the federal refugee resettlement policy is really tied into this idea of self-sufficiency. And the US refugee resettlement policy in the United States is really focused on self-sufficiency through early employment. And there are government programs that emphasize, you know, they emphasize employability and employment. Some programs are even incentivize our agency and clients to get employed early and not use public cash assistance. And so what it's important for everyone to know is that refugee resettlement agencies operate programs based on federal refugee resettlement policy. That informs our programs and what we do, what we're required to do, and what the outcomes are supposed to be. And we report all of those outcomes to you know, at the state level and to our national agency. So the Office of Refugee Resettlement determines eligibility for their funded services, and ORR, Office of Refugee Resettlement eligible populations include refugees, special immigrant visa holders, asylees, so people who have received asylum, not people who are seeking asylum, but who actually got asylum, survivors of human trafficking who have a specific kind of visa or document, and a couple of other smaller categories, including now Afghan humanitarian parolees. And the ORR eligibility, time eligibility for services is typically 5 years. So the 5-year mark after someone arrives or gets asylum or, you know, gets granted one of these statuses, that's the point where people are eligible typically for citizenship. And so that 5-year mark is something that the federal government puts as a time eligibility on services, and therefore on our services too. And at that point, a refugee or an asylee or an SIV typically becomes a citizen of the United States, just like you or me. And they're no longer eligible for, well, I'm not assuming that everyone's a citizen here, but at that time they become eligible. And their refugee status or asylee status is something that they may personally identify with, but they're no longer eligible for those services. So there are some exceptions, especially for older adults, and some other special exceptions, but across the United States, the most intensive services are provided within the first 3 months after arrival. This is called the reception and placement period. This is when people are assisted with getting a social security card, they get their housing set up, kids get enrolled in school, they see a primary care provider, all their benefits are applied for, all the things that are they connected to English language opportunities. All the basic requirements for reception and placement, and those are consistent across the entire country. Every refugee resettlement agency has the same requirements to meet within 3 months after arrival. At that point, clients become eligible for other programs. And in some localities across the United States, the resettlement agencies only operate that initial reception and placement program. They only have that 3-month program. We are really lucky, and we have a lot of continuing grants that fund services for longer periods of time. However, those grants are really focused on, again, self-sufficiency, employability, and community integration to a smaller extent. So what I can say is that our services continue up to 5 years after arrival. Any refugee, asylee, or anyone who has that ORR eligibility is eligible for case management, employment services, English language training, driver's education, youth mentoring, and various other things that our agency offers within those 5 years. And so that's a really big misconception in the community, that we only provide that initial support. What I would say is that all resettlement agencies provide a high level of support during the first 3 months. And then the idea is that this self-sufficiency kind of kicks in, and then they go into these other programs that are less intensive. And then coordinating with other agencies. So I would say refugee resettlement takes a village. We cannot do this work alone. We cannot be the only agency that, so sometimes I think about it as of like, what does self-sufficiency really mean for the refugee community, and what are things that need to happen at the community level for that to work? And what needs to happen is that other agencies who serve the general population must be able to also serve the refugee population. So language access, transportation, cultural responsiveness, particularly language access, is one of the biggest things. So it is absolutely in our mission to try to equip other agencies in the community to be able to serve this population effectively, because in reality, our community is not facilitating self-sufficiency of the refugee population if, you know, Catholic Charities is the only agency that can serve them. And so that's something that I'm invested in. Organizations like City of Refuge, Love Columbia, the Voluntary Action Center, First Chance for Children, Parents as Teachers. I mean, that doesn't even get started with all the health providers and mental health providers. And we collaborate with a large number of agencies. And, you know, right now we're working on a joint World Refugee Day celebration with City of Refuge, and inviting various partners to that. So community collaborate. I just had a meeting with the health department yesterday, so it's necessary, and that's something that I want to continue to grow. And especially now that we have this number of refugees, there's many agencies who are stepping up and saying, hey, like we can help in this area. For example, City of Refuge has a doula program where they serve moms who are pregnant, or sorry, not moms, people who are pregnant, and kind of walking through the pregnancy process with them and supporting them in a birth plan. This is not something that our agency offers. And so being able to like refer people to that program is complementary to what we do. And yeah, that's a good example. And I'm trying to think of any other like really clear examples. Well, the public health department, for example, we have a lot of clients who have health conditions that are being managed by the public health department, and they have their own staff who work closely with our clients, and then we would collaborate to do that. And the public health department is the, you know, the entity that needs to address those health issues, and and therefore, you know, collaborating with our agency to meet the needs of our shared mutual clients.
Herb and then Larry Brown.
I could not figure out what presently is the working tentative plan of Catholic Charities regarding the number of refugees which your organization might attempt to serve. Before you answer, I'd like you to receive my commendation to Catholic Charities in the United States for the wonderful work that it has done for a long time. Now, I will give you some options from which to choose. A, the organization hasn't a clue what's coming down in Ukraine, nor of US policy, and therefore it's hazarding no guess. Option two, you have formed a practical tentative plan regarding the limits of what you might expect to have in order to stimulate other organizations to come forward, but it's secret and could only be leaked, if at all, by a conservative supermajority member of the US Supreme Court. Or you may have a third option. How big a load do you think Catholic Charities can handle in terms of numbers of people to plan to serve?
Well, thank you.
For a hot potato.
I'm gonna go with number two. I think that what I know is that there is a strong interest in supporting Ukrainian refugees in our community, and just the outpouring of support and people calling and saying they already want to help, you know, over the past month or two has been very significant, and that the level of community support is one of the major factors that I would take into consideration, and that our national agency would take into consideration regarding allocation of refugees. It's one of the greatest predictors of positive outcomes, and it enhances our agency's capacity. We have our community sponsorship program, but it's not active in Sedalia. So, and that's one thing that we're looking at, and that would be a factor too, because with the Afghan humanitarian parolees, we were able to expand capacity in large part because of the community sponsorship programs in these other communities. So I would say it's we have an idea, but not a public-facing one that's been fully formulated yet.
So it is secret.
It's not. I mean, we will not see. It's a very different scenario than the Afghan evacuation efforts. We're not going to see likely anything at that scale.
Okay, Larry?
Yes, I just wanted to offer kudos. I was a team leader for settling 3 Bosnian families a number of years ago, had a wonderful experience getting them to public health, getting them to employment and to ESL, et cetera, then also worked with a Sierra Leone family as well. And just want to say, working as a sponsor, and this was via a congregation, but that's just a wonderful experience. So spreading the word that individuals and social groups, congregations, and so on, getting into the sponsorship at the nitty gritty is a good experience. And working with Catholic Refugee Settlement was great too. So thank you.
Thanks, Larry. It's really, I mean, sponsors, community members do things that our staff just can't. I mean, the social support, the being able to see people really on a very consistent basis, getting to know them, the community integration aspects are things that our agency, we just can't do. And so in partnership with community sponsorship groups, it really, I mean, these people are learning English so fast because they have those community sponsors who see them frequently, and they're getting integrated in our community so quickly, and they're able to, you know, face the challenges of adjusting to a new culture with support. And so community sponsorship is so integral to welcoming refugees in our community. And it's a way that we can enhance our agency capacity to serve more people, bring more people into our community, and enhance outcomes too. So I thank you for, you know,
it was wonderful
effort.
to see the children then become the translators because they pick up the language so rapidly. And in one case, we were able to connect with the family when they moved later to Atlanta, and to see the follow-up after that. So it can be a long-term relationship too.
And it's life-changing for everyone involved. Yep. If people are
and Mari?
interested in community sponsorship. Oh, sorry, go ahead. I'm going to type in the chat.
Oh, okay. I mean, cut in line. I think I was next. I'm not sure I was or not, but let me join in kudos to Herb and Larry in terms of the efforts of your group. I'm still a little bit concerned. We're very reactive in this country, and we always respond to the Afghan situation or now the Ukraine situation and so on. We've had a long-standing, ongoing border situation, and there are lots of other communities. We certainly are reaping the benefits of diversity from the cream of some of these cultures. These people who are willing to, you know, to get out there. How are you handling the background, the residuals, the background? There's lots of other demand for this, and I'm sure you're busy dealing with some of the reaction to the most recent crisis. What about the rest of it?
Yeah, if I'm understanding your question, like you're curious about
Well,
Just the regular.
the differences between refugees and asylees, and even the southern border in terms of some of the South American country or Central American countries and so on.
Yeah, I think what I was just in a director's level meeting yesterday, and the directors were commenting on how it's really a very stark difference, the resources that are being put into serving the you know, Afghan humanitarian parolees versus other Office of Refugee Resettlement eligible populations, or even other, like you're mentioning, people who are seeking asylum, for example. The US government is investing a lot of resources in serving the Afghan population, and that is amazing. And the pie should be big enough and needs to be big enough, you know, to serve everyone. So I think what we're seeing is renewed interest and capacity building for serving all kinds of populations. You know, the resources that we have now, for example, being able to have all these housing staff is because of you know, the funding coming in to really support the influx of the Afghan refugees, but that's going to have lasting impacts on our ability to serve all of these populations. So I don't know if that exactly does that answer your question to some extent?
Well, in part, that's an interesting point about the capacity building and benefiting all kinds of other issues. Well, I mean, it's the reactiveness, I think, that which is appropriate, but on the other hand, there is a huge demand. There has always been a huge demand. There are other issues, and we seem to just focus on the ones that are in the news, right?
Yeah. Like we go through this huge process with Afghanistan, and then all of a sudden it's Ukraine, and everyone's on to the next thing. And what I know about refugee resettlement is that it's often referred to as like a feast or famine program because of the way that it's funded. It's funded in large part per capita. So the funding is tied to the number of people who actually arrive at local sites. And this creates a situation where we never know exactly what our funding is going to look like. And there's a lot of external factors impacting that. And for sustainability and capacity building for the refugee resettlement infrastructure, this is a huge challenge. And so I hope, that the funding mechanisms and the way we think about these systems and inform the programs that serve these populations is learning. We're learning a lot from what has happened because we went from a really low capacity to needing to serve a very high capacity, and just how the enormous stress that put on the system given where we were at due to the federal funding mechanisms and things like that.
Samantha, thank you. I was going to, I think you may have just answered part of my question, but in the few minutes we have left, I was wondering if you could highlight the biggest challenges you face. I think you just mentioned one of them there, and tell us what, if anything, we as a group or as individuals could maybe do to help.
Thanks, David. I think for me right now, the biggest challenge we're facing is scaling up, continuing to scale up to meet the needs, and going from a small refugee resettlement agency to a quite large one, operating in multiple locations with various departments and positions that we've never had before. So my challenge as a director is knowing, well, what are the numbers going to look like next year, and how do I plan and staff, and how do I it's very challenging in the kind of environment that we have to plan for refugee resettlement. Who knows when the next, Ukraine happens and Afghanistan happens, and it's this constant uncertainty of what funding we're going to have, what programs are going to be developed, what requirements are going to change, what arrivals and admissions are going to look like. So for me, being able to structure programs around so much uncertainty is incredibly, it's challenging. And in terms of what people can do, so there's going to be very soon, and the language might be changing based on what the policy director said yesterday in our meeting, but an Afghan Adjustment Act. This is something that would allow the Afghan humanitarian parolees to have their status just adjusted across the board, instead of us having to go through the process of applying for special immigrant visa status or asylum for every single person or family. And so if your group could keep an eye on that legislation, just like you are for many other things, that would be helpful. Also, if you're interested in community sponsorship or volunteering, I put in the chat Lacey Strassner. She's our new community sponsorship coordinator. We're always looking for new groups who are interested in doing this kind of thing. It's Rotary clubs, faith communities, neighborhoods. There's all different kinds of groups who get involved. So also, obviously, making donations is helpful, and that can be done via our website, or making a volunteering is another kind of important contribution that can be made. We need volunteers to help with transportation, with English language learning, with accompanying people to medical appointments, with office work. There's a variety of different ways in which volunteers are really integral to our operations. So the community sponsors are a certain type of volunteer who work directly with specific families.
Larry,
Well, you may not be able to address this, but what, if any, relationship can you have to folks that are involved in the sanctuary movement, particularly looking, this may tag on to what Carl was asking about too, folks particularly coming out of Central America, undocumented, those kind of, can you have any relationship to them at all?
Yes, we do work with some people from Central America who have temporary protected status from right now El Salvador, and we support them in petitioning for their minor children to join them in the United States through the Central American Minors Program. Those people are here under temporary protected status. So the sanctuary movement is more for people who may be, for example, undocumented. But what we know is that there's a lot of mixed status households, and there's a lot of, families that have different statuses and things like that. So in our purview is to support people in petitioning for their minor children in Central America to join them here through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. And we're doing that with at least 2 different cases right now. In terms of the sanctuary movement, we absolutely interface with other organizations that serve newcomers. We also, what we know is that we, a couple of years ago, served a woman who had asylum, and her family members were seeking asylum, and certain members of her family were undocumented. As soon as she got asylum, she could then access our services, which benefited her entire family while their cases were still pending. Missouri Faith Voices, I believe, has taken a lot of the initiative for, I think, local sanctuary. And so we are paying attention to what they're doing, obviously, because we serve people who have family members who, could benefit from these kinds of things. And so, yeah, I mean, we all need to be working together because of the, to support and build infrastructure and create a welcoming community.
All right. I think we're about out of time here. So I want to thank you, Samantha, for coming and sharing this with us. Appreciate it very much. Appreciate your time. Everyone
Thank you all.
Thank everyone who was here. Remember to come back next week. We're going to hear from Ms. Whitley of the MOST group and find out what they do. I will remind our officers that we're going to have an officer meeting now. But for the rest of you, welcome, take off and have a great day, or stick around if you like. So we'll give a few seconds here for everyone to sign. Again, thanks a lot, Samantha. Appreciate your time.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, Samantha. Excellent
yes, thank you,
presentation.
Samantha.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your great questions and for everything you're doing.